Welcome back to Concussion Code. This is Lori, Dean and Lori, and I'm just delighted that I'm bringing you a really different session today. Today is a moment between women. Today is a moment between two women who have experienced loss. And it is also what I believe is a very powerful movement of women who are willing to speak about their loss, who are willing to teach others about their loss, but to do it from a perspective of hope and possibility and of absolutely undying, beautiful love. Lynda Cheldelin Fell. Have I said that correctly? What I want her to do is I want her to take some time with us on this show, and I want her to share her journey, but most importantly, some of her learnings, and have a dialogue with me about the grief that I've been experiencing. I'm willing to invite others into my journey because this journey is so important and so precious. I started my career in palliative care, where my job was actually to help dying children say goodbye to their parents. That was what I did for a living. And I loved what I did for a job. It's probably the most important job I've ever had in my life, is actually being with somebody through to the end of their life and watching them whisper their final farewells to somebody that they care for. Having them squeeze my hand and make me promise that I will care for them. But what happened in that journey was I understood and learned about grief. I was blessed to learn from Helen Hayes. I was blessed to learn from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I was blessed to come to a place of understanding. So when my husband had an accident and I lost some of those freedoms and simplicities of a relationship, I lost some of the freedoms and the joy that we had. I started realizing that life was going to be forever different after his series of concussions and this last horrific bobcat accident that he had. And over the course of 26 months, I am getting my husband back, but that is not always the case. We can't make that promise. And so, Lynda, with you here on the show, I'm wondering if you would help us talk a little bit about the journey of grief when the person doesn't die, the person doesn't pass on, but instead that person has survived something that's been very traumatic. But you and I, as the wives, have a whole new experience. And I'm just wondering if, as experienced as you are, an author, a national educator, the co-founder of the Grief Institute, I am just so pleased if you would take a few moments to share with us.
Oh, of course. Well, thank you so much for having me. So, my husband suffered a disabling stroke 8 years ago, and it came on the heels of losing our 15-year-old daughter in a car accident. And men are wired differently than women, and they tend to keep their emotions to themselves. And so at age 46, all that grief that my husband felt inside, trying to be the strong one for our family, and for me, his wife in particular, it just really, it became the perfect storm. And one day in June, 8 years ago, he suffered this disabling stroke, and he was robbed of his speech, his reading, his writing. He was paralyzed down his entire right side. And suddenly the rug was pulled out from underneath us a second time in life. And um, what happened with us was that first I didn't know if he would survive. Would he live? And if he did survive the stroke, when he came out of the coma, would he be the man that I knew and loved?
Yes.
And so for the first couple of years after his stroke, I was on adrenaline. I just didn't have time to even think about what my needs were and the grief that I was facing, because the truth is, when you experience something like that, when your loved one doesn't die, but yet you're grieving the person they were or the relationship that you had, something that you lost, it's called grieving for the living. And it's very hard to grieve for something that is still here, because on one hand you feel very blessed that they're still alive, that you still have them in the flesh and blood. On the other hand, there's a significant amount of grief that your heart has to reconcile with the person that you knew is now a little bit different. And in my case, my husband, who, he managed multi-million dollar jobs, lots and lots of workers, and a lot of stress and such. He was the man. He was the boss. And suddenly, he couldn't walk. He couldn't move. He couldn't talk. It was very, very hard for him. And it was suddenly very hard for me to do that role reversal where I was in charge. And so, long story short, I, no one gave me a playbook on what to expect because, as it is with concussions and such, no two are the same. So, same with a stroke, no two patients are the same. And your journey is going to be unique to you depending upon parameters. And so that's why they don't give you a playbook. Also, I think that, had they shared with me that this was going to be a long, hard road, you're already in the throes of adrenaline. What does this mean for life? And how are we going to bring in an income? How are we going to keep a roof over our head? He's the breadwinner kind of thing. Everything is shifting. And it's like being in a snow globe where nothing is settled. And so that is my journey. That is my background. And with my husband today, 8 years later, I've got lots of wisdom to share about what that journey looks like and what to expect and how to take care of yourself along the way. Long story short, my husband has regained a lot of the faculties that the stroke robbed him of, far more than they expected him to. He will always be disabled, and I will always be looking out for him and taking good care of him. But at the same time, we lead a very meaningful life.
Right.
And he's still my husband. And so I'm very, very grateful for that. The times where, he's frustrated with something, behaviors that were not characteristic of him prior to the stroke that he exhibits now, those are still adjustments. They're adjustments. And so I give both he and I a lot of grace in it. And so it's a journey that takes time to, to get your being about, you're finding your steps and such. But there is hope at the end of the tunnel. And that's what I want your viewers to know.
Mhm, mhm. Powerful. My agency has always been called A New Day Begins, and it was intentionally because with the beginning of every day, with the birth of a new dawn, we have a chance to have a fresh start. I retired 13 years ago thinking that my time for teaching, speaking, and empowering other people in the area of relationships was over. I thought that part of my career was finished. And then this concussion comes. We get through it with more blessings than perhaps others can get through. And Dean and I both feel so convicted that we had an unfair advantage, and we really want to put information out there to those so they can anticipate what the triggers are, that they can anticipate what this man who was the leader, the multi-million dollar project man, he has those blessings and those gifts of that part of his character. But that means he can also become brash and demanding. He can also be very much dictatorial, telling his team exactly how he's going to be treated, not really looking for how they're going to bring him a program. He's still in charge. And to take control away from somebody who has had that much control in their life, you're asking for issues to arise. And so this is really the development of what happens. So A New Day Begins is about hope and possibility, and it's a free Facebook group, coaching, just tidbits so that people have a place to just go and be encouraged. But the concussion code is really where I'm thinking if somebody has experienced this, they are going to be typing in. And when they see relationships and concussion, I'm hoping they'll be willing to come hear our story and to see our vulnerability and exposure. But the element that people understand is communication. I can get people to hear that part very quickly. What they don't understand is the underlying grief. We used to call it disenfranchised grief, and that's where we're not able to truly fully express our grief because of societal judgment or community judgment. Who are you to complain? He's alive. You should be grateful. My son actually has a wife who has MS, and at 33 years old, it was a big transition for him to accept the fact that their life is forever changed. But he can't say anything anywhere because he's so grateful that she's so high functioning. He's so grateful to still have her. And I found myself in the very same spot. I'm so grateful. And yet I do miss things that we used to do that we can't do anymore. So this grief of the grieving the living, could you go into that a little bit more?
Well, grief comes in many different experiences. And so when you mention the word grief, a lot of people associate it with death of a loved one. Yet, when we lose a career, when we lose a home, when we lose a relationship, when our loved one has suffered a life altering head injury, or any other kind of illness or injury, there are many dynamics of grief that we don't recognize. And it's important to recognize them,
Mhm.
because if you are aware of them, then can begin to fill your toolbox with tools for dealing with it. And so that's why what you're doing right now, Lori, is so important, because with grieving the living, and in our case, it would be grieving the husband we knew,
Right.
at the same time embracing the husband we have now. It's can be very, very challenging. And so there's some guilt that comes along with it, because when you feel angry at your spouse, because with the head injury, they often have either emotional lability or their filters about this. Or they have a very short fuse where they didn't have where they had patience of a saint before. And so when you encounter moments like that, you feel irritable, or you feel angry, or you feel guilty for missing the person they were before. And such, there's a lot of dynamics that we don't verbalize, and society is not comfortable allowing us to verbalize them.
Mhm.
um, and so it's very important that we have that space to talk about them. And so grieving for the living is just that, grieving for something that has shifted in our life that we didn't see coming, or we didn't plan on, or we wish had never happened.
Yeah.
And so it's
My husband's, sorry to cut you off. My first experience is anger. My husband was so angry that he had an accident that was preventable, that changed the course of the rest of our life. So he too is grieving, and we grieve differently. As you said, men and women grieve differently.
Yeah. And so women on average talk, for every one word a man says, a woman says seven. And so, right there, that's just one of the inherent differences between men and women. And so, when men grieve, they tend to keep it to themselves. Women tend to be more external with their grief if given the opportunity. What that
Mhm.
means is that we have girlfriends, or sisters or mothers, someone who allows us to verbalize what we are feeling inside, externalizing our emotions. And men do not go up to each other and say, "What are you really feeling today?" you know? Uh, they just don't have that sacred space held for them the way that we do. And yet they grieve just as much.
Mhm.
And so you're absolutely right. Your husband and my husband both grieve what they lost.
Yeah.
And it's important for us as their caregivers and their partners is to honor that they don't like it either. And
No.
it's hard to remember that when they are irritating you,
Irritable.
or what have you. It's hard to remember that this is an adjustment for them too, because we tend to go inside ourselves and have those internal dialogues in our head on, oh gosh darn it, it wasn't this way before, kind of thing. And yet at the same time, they don't like it either. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's very important to understand that both of us are grieving. They
Mhm.
are, and we are.
Right. I I understand and find it very powerful, all the different definitions of courage. But one of the things that's inspired me most to follow your career and to follow your works, Lynda, has been that you are living my definition of courage.
Mm.
Courage is grace under pressure. I see you as a woman of grace, and I know that you're under pressure. Like you said, some of those pressures were just the adrenaline of the physical care, of the changing living circumstances, modifying your home. I remember you guys had to do some major modifications to your home, but then modifying your income source, modifying everything in your life. You had pressure. You still have pressure, and you still have grace. And by default, you have courage. And the willingness that you have to speak up and to come through your grief to a place of teaching and to a place where you are willing to expose your pain so that others can relate to you is beyond inspiring. And not all educators have that. Not all co-founders of international grief institutes have that heart and have the emotion that you bring to this message. Grief is a beautiful thing. One of the programs I'm working on right now is called Beautifully Broken, because if when you have a rock, I found a rock, it was given to me actually by one of my clients, and it's two pieces, absolutely beautiful inside, just amazing. When you put them together, they're perfect, but it's just a gray rock on the outside. But broken, it's sparkling, and there's pinks and purples and all these colors inside. And he just reminded me with that rock, and it stayed in my office for years, that we're actually, when we're exposed, we're more beautiful. When we're real, we're more beautiful. When we're broken, in many ways, we become more authentic, more vulnerable, and more precious. You seem to be able to pick that message up in all of your teaching and your speaking engagements that I've watched. It inspires me to believe that there's a way to bring this message to the world that doesn't just become a mechanical message, that we can stay real and make sure that other women hear us, that people that are going through traumatic brain injury in whatever form, that they can hear us. How have you navigated your audience that way? Because your audience, I'm assuming, are people that are grieving.
Absolutely. And so navigating the audiences, it's very important to engage them in the dialogue. And I'm a big fan of that. Wherever I teach, no matter the platform or the stage or the auditorium or the classroom, I engage with the audience as much as possible. And I think that there is value in the two-way exchange rather than me standing on a stage just doing a one-way dialogue.
Mhm.
When we are allowed audience members to stand and give them a mic and share 30 seconds or 60 seconds, we all learn.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I learn from them, they learn from me, we learn from each other. It's really an exchange of information. At the same time, it's an exchange, just as you said, of courage. When we talk about our own imperfect journey,
Mhm.
that's courageous because we live in a world that idolizes perfection. And so when we go there to that imperfect place, we're honoring ourselves. And when we're brave, we make others brave.
Right.
And the beauty of that is that, just as you said, you take a gray rock, but when you break it in half, there's some really beautiful insides, and you don't know until you've been broken. And it's
Mhm.
called post-traumatic growth. And so you can learn and become an even better person than you were prior. What's really hard is that when you're in the throes of it, when that adrenaline is at the helm of your ship and you're on autopilot, everything feels very scary because it feels out of your control. But if you can remember that during all of that, great growth is taking place, and someday you're able to look back and say, wow, that was really uncomfortable. That was really painful. That hurt tremendously. But look at where we are now. And
Right.
so that's why I always share that 8 years after my husband's stroke, we live a very blessed life. Is it perfect? No, of course not. And nor would I want it to be. That would be boring.
And it's not the same. It's not
No,
the same as it was
no.
before. It's
Yeah,
become
and so
deeper.
I've grown from it. And I think that if we can encourage one another to be open to the idea that first off, there is hope that one day it won't always feel this bad. And the other idea too is that collateral blessings can be had along the way. Then we help people not be so afraid of the future.
Right.
And I think that those collateral blessings are what's important to hold on to. And the inside of that rock that is beautiful colors, that's what I call collateral blessings. It wouldn't have come about if that rock hadn't been broken open.
Mhm.
So,
So I'm experiencing a lot of people. We've just launching. This is a new program. We're just launching it. Already, the response has been unbelievable. I would not have believed how many women are are starving to be heard.
yeah.
What are some strategies that you've recommended for them to deal with that numbness, anxiety that they feel, the ball that they're experiencing? There's so many different presentations. Maybe you could help our audience think about what they could do to help themselves through this period in time.
One of the biggest things that you can do for yourself, well, there's two really important recommendations I have. One is to advocate for yourself. And we often think, oh, we don't want to make waves. We don't want people to think we're weak. That's not what it's about. It's about advocating for where you might need help to shore up the areas where you're feeling like you could use a little bit of help with. Okay, so advocating when you go to see the doctor, advocating for yourself and being authentic, being honest, and putting it out there. And so advocating for yourself is really important. And that means telling your friends and family what you need and don't need. Okay. If you can, do it with grace,
Mhm.
because it's so easy to tell them what you don't need. I don't need to hear that. I don't need to do, this, what inherently you need. But when you can articulate it in a kind and compassionate way, because they don't know. And so you can help them, you know, by telling them what you need. That's advocating for yourself. The other thing is doing a self care plan. And so when you go through a major upheaval such as this, it affects you emotionally, physically, spiritually, socially, behaviorally. So when you create a care plan, and we have a care plan for both grievers as well as people who are supporters of grievers. And
Mhm.
so I'm happy to get those to you, and they're PDFs, and people can print them out and use them to help create their own care plan. And what that means is honoring your needs, okay? Because you can't pour from an empty glass. And so you can't help your husband, you can't help yourself if your battery is empty. And so taking care of yourself by the self-care, plan is one way to really help weather this. And so one of the other things that I want to share too that's really important is to go by the rule of five. Because when you're in the midst of all of this and your snow globe has been shaken up and you're not sure what, life feels turned upside down, it's really, really helpful to remember the rule of five. And you've got five senses, right? So every day, treat yourself to five things that you can see that brings you pleasure, that you can taste, that you can smell, that you can touch, that bring you pleasure. They evoke that physical pleasure in you because it's a reminder then that not all pleasure is lost.
Yeah,
Okay.
I love that. One of the things that we have created that you'd think that we had orchestrated this a little bit. So I wrote a book called The Post Concussion Playbook. Can't even believe it. It's called The Playbook.
Well, I'm a big fan of playbooks and I think we need more. So good for you.
So the post concussion playbook talks about special teams, it talks about offensive plays, and it talks about defensive plays, things that we could do to accelerate our healing and brain healing, relationship healing, things that we can do that would just prevent us from being irritable, from being short tempered with one another. But the skill training that we're adding to this marketplace is actually how to speak kindly, how to express yourself, how to openly understand what your needs are, and to have and to teach people how they can come towards you instead of repelling them. So we are actually doing a communication skill training within the context of life after injury. And that's really what I believe my gifting is in that capacity. And so to actually acknowledge and understand their trauma, to understand and acknowledge the grieving that's happening within that context. But then I think my space is some tools. That toolkit is what I think is what I add to the combination. But it's just another piece of the journey. There's so many twists and turns on this road that, people may think that their grief journey has had its expiration date, that they were grieving and it's over. I'm wondering if you could share a few words about what to expect with this journey called grief and how it plays itself out over time.
Well, grief is not one size fits all. And that's very, very important because people who mean well will say, well, my neighbor lost a child and she grieved for 2 years or 6 months or lifetime, what have you. So it's not one size fits all. So resist the urge to compare yourself to others. And I think also it's important to know that the grief models that are out there, there are the 5 stages of grief by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which is probably the most well-known, but there's the 2 stages, the 3 stages, the 4 stages, the 7 stages. They're all just models. They're theories by researchers who are trying to put sense into something that feels senseless. They're
Mhm.
trying to structure it for us to understand. And I think it's really important with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in particular. Her 5 stage model was meant for people who were dying, not the loved ones left behind. And so
Definitely agree.
that one, unfortunately, continues to be taught as a 5 model theory for what grief looks like for those of us who are alive, who lost someone they love. And I have to confess that when I lost my daughter 11 years ago, I was very familiar with Dr. Kubler-Ross's work and I expected those 5 stages. And for me, they didn't happen that way at all. And I felt like I'd failed grief. So it wasn't until I came to an understanding that was intended for people who were on their deathbed, not for their loved ones, that I began to understand that grief is not one size fits all. I call it the grief dance, where one day you might take a step forward, one day you might take 2 steps back, one day it's a step to the left, maybe the next day 2 steps to the right, but eventually, you find yourself facing forward and the pain feels a little less raw. And so, with regards to the stages and such, it's really, those are just theories and it's not one size fits all. And you are going to grieve exactly how your body needs to grieve, how your spirit needs to grieve, because our adverse childhood experiences, our ACEs, that's going to impact how we grieve. Our personality makeup is going to impact how we grieve. There's so many different parameters that it's impossible to put us all into one nice, neat and tidy box. And so with regards to a timeline, don't give yourself a timeline because your relationship with your loved one, whether they are living or deceased, is unique to you and that person. And so for many of us, that grief becomes part of who we are for life. And we learn that the heart can hold joy at the same time as sorrow. We don't have to choose. People have this perception that we either are going to be happy or we're going to be grieving. And the truth is that grief is one of those emotions that we can have in our heart at the same time as others. And so it's important to know that we can move forward with grief in our heart because the joy will also be there. And some
Oh,
days the grief, plays a stronger role, and some days the joy plays a stronger role. Okay, and it's just important to give yourself grace, no matter what's happening in that moment. That doesn't mean that that moment is going to be the rest of your life. And so, just take a big deep breath, give yourself grace. And if you're having a rough moment, just know that around every corner is fresh hope.
mhm.
Just as you said, with every new dawn, there's fresh hope. And one of the things that I like to do for people is to remind them that they have the power within themselves to help trigger the happy hormones. Okay, so when you're grieving, your brain is full of the stress hormones, the adrenaline, the cortisol, etc. And so you have the power to trigger the happy hormones, the endorphins. And one of the ways you can do that is to dance for 3 minutes when no one's looking. Okay.
Mm,
Dancing, laughing, watch I Love Lucy reruns or MASH or whatever gets you a good belly laugh. Those kinds of things trigger the happy hormones. Okay. They don't solve your grief, but they
yeah.
do bring you joy, and your heart can hold both. You don't have to choose.
Oh, that is exactly what I needed to hear from me, let alone what our audience needs to hear. So when I did that work, I was working palliative care, and those women were teaching the dying how to manage it. But there was very little conversation that ever got around the rest of the room, to the child, to the mother, to the father. But to me, grief is like a wave. It's a wave of emotion that comes and it just overwhelms you and then it disappears and it just keeps moving in and out, like you say, that dance we call grief. But that dance is quite equivalent and quite similar to the dance of joy. It's just two sides. If you've truly loved, then you will truly hurt when something is taken away.
Right.
And so I've always tried just to remind people that this too will pass, but to hear and be reminded about the fact that grief is one of those emotions that can exist in your heart alongside joy. What a fabulous reminder to people because they can get so consumed, and the world tries to victimize people, and we don't have to accept that. We don't have to do that.
Well, when you're in the throes of it and your heart feels nothing but grief, it's hard to ever understand or accept the possibility that the heart will hold anything other than that grief.
Mhm.
And I promise you, eventually it does get less raw. And you won't notice it right away, and you may not notice it for a while. But eventually you'll have little sparks of joy. And then over time, those sparks become more frequent, they become longer lasting. You have moments of joy where you are gut rolling laughing, and then you think, oh, that felt good, right? And
Absolutely.
so, really, it's about learning to move forward with your loved one in your heart. So, whether they're alive or they're deceased, you can still move forward with that love.
Mhm.
Okay. We don't live in a perfect world, but that doesn't mean that we have to surround ourselves only with that one emotion of grief. You
Right,
can learn to move forward with both of them.
right. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And we have to just hope that women will reach out to one another, that they'll look for their soul sisters, that they'll look for that voice, they'll look for that place where they can be heard. You are a very safe place for people to be heard. You've put together amazing materials for people. Where would our audience go to find some of the materials that you're talking about or to follow your journey?
The internationalgriefinstitute.com has a lot of free resources. Griefdiaries.com. There's some free resources there as well. And I'm the founding partner of the International Grief Institute. I also created Grief Diaries as that place for us to share our journeys. That is free from criticism, free from someone trying to guide us. It's just a place where we can have that sacred space to just be. And so anything that we create for International Grief Institute, I share on Grief Diaries. So yeah, so people can go there. They can also email me, Lynda with a Y at lindafell.com, and I'm happy to give them PDFs. We have lots and lots of resources, and I'm happy to share because
Oh,
truly we're all in this together. And it's important for people who haven't yet found their moments of hope for us to be that hope for them until they find their own.
absolutely. There's so much power. There's just so much power in people locking arms, and we truly are of the belief that all things are possible to and for those who choose to believe and lock arms. If those of us who are willing will lock arms and help share the burden, to share the weight of those that have been burdened by life's extraordinary experiences. Your husband having a stroke at 46, you said, 43. Um, that's an extraordinary experience. That's not something that you expect. rolling a bobcat isn't something you were planning on doing that morning. I just look at people that are going through, even COVID falls under that. People that are struggling and figuring out how to handle all this emotion when they're in the midst of a pandemic, when we have so much information from media hitting us and coming to us from a negative perspective. How powerful it is for us to be able to lock arms and to remind people that all things are possible and that we are locking arms, that we're trying to bring resources that are authentic and real and part of our own learning and share them with the rest of the world. So I just really want to thank you for joining me. I want you to thank you for your life work.
Oh,
And
thank
I
you.
just believe that God truly chose to use these circumstances to have you stand up and to lift others on your shoulders so they can see more, they can be more, and that they can know that they're loved. So I just really want to personally thank you
Thank
for
you.
your vulnerability and authenticity.
Well, thank you for doing what you're doing.
Uh-huh.
I stand and applaud you.